Please don't look at me like that." His voice was hoarse, dry, and so faint you'd have to lean in to catch it. Samuel Jones kept his head bowed, his calloused hands trembling as he placed a few crumpled, sweat-damp dollar bills onto the gleaming glass counter. On the other side, a single glossy chocolate mousse cake sat apart from a neat row of pastel-colored macarons and fruit tarts arranged like a still-life painting. The air was thick with the scent of butter, sugar, and vanilla, as if every breath was wrapped in luxury. Warm yellow light washed over white walls, bouncing off every polished brass detail. Everything here was designed to make customers feel they belonged to another world, one that had no place for faded gray uniforms with frayed collars and sleeves stained with old grease like Samuel's. The young shop girl behind the counter froze. Her eyes held a mix of pity and puzzlement, as though silently asking, "What is he doing here?" It was that look that forced Samuel to speak, a reflex, the last shield he could raise to protect what little dignity he had left. He didn't want to be turned into a story of pity in someone else's mind. He didn't need anyone prying into why a janitor had stepped in the wealthiest bakery in New York to buy a single small cake. In the corner near the window, another man was watching. The maintenance uniform hanging loose on his tall frame didn't fit, and the brim of his cap was pulled low, hiding most of his face. But his eyes, calm, intent, missed nothing. This was Julian Croft, CEO of the Ethelgard Academy, an elite private school on the outskirts of New York, known for shaping gifted but underprivileged students into success stories. The academy was celebrated as a golden ticket to the future, boasting multi-million-dollar facilities, advanced programs, and an almost perfect success rate. But Julian wasn't here to buy pastries. He was in the middle of a quiet investigation. The student happiness reports he'd been receiving lately were as smooth and glossy as the glass in front of Samuel, full of awards, achievements, and prestigious scholarships, without a single blemish. Perfect to the point of being fake. And he knew the truth never lived on paper. It hid in the shadows the administration didn't want anyone to see. So he'd shelved his tailored suits, shaved off his neatly trimmed beard, and put on a cheap maintenance uniform under the fake name J to embed himself in the lowest rung of the very system he'd built. He believed that only by looking up from the bottom could he see what was rotting inside. At the academy, Julian had seen things the security cameras never caught. The forced smiles of students passing the administration, the weary eyes of teachers crushed under quotas, Principal DeAngelis preaching empathy to the board before walking past a crying student in the library without a glance. Amid it all, Samuel Jones was an exception. He didn't just mop floors. Every sweep of his broom felt like a ritual. He was the only one who truly saw the kids. When a student walked by, he'd pause just long enough to ask softly, "You okay today, kid?" A question no one else seemed to bother with. But to the rest of the academy, Samuel was invisible. Outside his quiet work hours, he stood out for only one thing. Every Tuesday evening, exactly at 6:15, he disappeared. No one asked, no one cared. Today was Tuesday, and before Julian's eyes, Samuel had just spent what little he had on a chocolate mousse cake. He took the box, cradling it as though it were a treasure, and headed for the door. Outside, rain had begun to fall, streetlights smearing into trembling golden streaks across the wet pavement. At the far side of the shop, a few elegant customers chatted about an upcoming charity auction. None of them noticed the old man in the gray uniform. No one did, except Julian. He knew he'd just found the first crack in the flawless glass of Ethelgard. And once you see a crack, you can't look away. Julian tilted his head slightly, as if speaking to an invisible audience. Sometimes, to find the truth, you have to follow someone the world has stopped seeing. Samuel pushed open the door and vanished into the cold rain. Julian rose, tugged the brim of his cap lower, and stepped out, leaving behind the warm, butter-scented glow of the Upper East Side to follow, crossing from a world he controlled down to the one where he was no one at all. The glass door of the bakery closed behind him, the faint chime of the bell fading into silence, and the world inside vanished like a film scene cutting to the next shot. Cold rain struck Julian's face, pulling him back into the reality of Jay, the man no one noticed, the one who could follow an old janitor without being questioned. Samuel walked faster than his tired frame suggested, the white cake box pressed tightly to his chest, shielded from the rain by a bent arm, as if a single drop could ruin the gift inside. Julian kept his distance, his steps falling into the quiet rhythm of a city shedding its skin. They left the cobblestone streets, with a glow of shop windows and the lingering scent of roasting coffee still warmed the air. Just a few blocks later, the scenery shifted. Stately old buildings gave way to bare concrete blocks with fewer windows and dimmer lights. Samuel never once looked back. He crossed a wide avenue, waiting at the red light like someone who had memorized the city's breathing. Julian followed, realizing he'd stepped over an invisible border, from affluence into the outskirts, where New York grew sharper, rougher, and more real. The rain sounded different here. In the Upper East Side, it had tapped gently on awnings and glass, like a measured beat. Here, it hammered on tin roofs and splashed into dark puddles with a heavy, wet thud. Even the smell had changed. The damp grass scent was gone, replaced by the reek of wet trash and the oily smoke from a hole-in-the-wall eatery. Samuel led Julian across a highway overpass. Under the flicker of a street lamp, the roar of trucks overhead landed like hammer blows in the air. On the other side, they stepped into a muddy lot beside a high concrete wall covered in faded graffiti. And there, under a low bridge, Julian saw a figure. The boy sat on an old mattress, back against a pillar, hands buried deep in the sleeves of a hoodie. His face was thin, hair unkempt, eyes bright with intelligence but dull by light. The pale gray hoodie bore the Ethelgard crest, now frayed, stained, and worn like a relic from another life. Samuel stepped into that shadow without hesitation. He knelt before the boy, ignoring the damp, dirty ground. Julian stayed back, hidden behind a pillar, slowing his breath to catch every word. Samuel opened the cake box. Inside was the chocolate mousse from the Upper East Side bakery. It wasn't a birthday cake, yet he carefully set a small candle into it, cupping his trembling hands around the flame to shield it from the wind and rain. "Happy anniversary," he said softly, like a breeze. "The day they gave up on you." "But I didn't." Julian froze. This wasn't a celebration. It was a memorial for a loss. The day this boy had been cast out of Ethelgard. Leo. The name surfaced in his mind like an old scar being touched. Leo Vargas. The student whose file he had once read. A rare talent. Able to draw emotions others couldn't express in words. But also labeled a rebel. The notes in his record were sterile and cold. Does not fit the academy culture. Work deemed unsettling. Bureaucratic language that concealed the truth. He had been discarded to keep Ethelgard's record spotless. Julian remembered Leo's paintings, cities under gray rain, faces without eyes, hands with fingers fading away. The administration called it negative expression. Now, Julian called it foresight. The candle flickered in the wind. Leo blew it out, and for an instant in the sudden darkness, his face was cloaked in a quiet shadow, almost at peace. Samuel smiled, offered him the first bite of cake, then sat beside him, silently sharing the rest. The sight made Julian's stomach turn, not from the cold seeping into his skin, but from the realization pounding in his chest. He was the architect of this system, a system proud of nurturing young talent, yet built to discard anyone who didn't fit the mold. He stepped back, leaning against the pillar. Rain slid down the back of his neck, icy to the bone, but nothing could sharpen him more than this moment. This wasn't just a crack. It was a chasm, and he was staring straight into it. Samuel and Leo remained there, their silhouettes etched onto the concrete wall by the distant, flickering streetlight. Two figures, one old, one young, bound by a flame now extinguished and a piece of chocolate mousse cake. Julian knew that from this moment on, he could never return to Ethelgard unchanged. Curiosity had hardened into something else, a weight and a promise he had yet to speak aloud. He turned away, leaving the underpass before they could see him. But the image of the candle in the rain, the strange anniversary wish, and Leo's extinguished eyes followed him with every step. The next morning, Julian returned to Ethelgard while the air was still thick with fog. The floor-to-ceiling glass walls reflected a pale light, making the place look like a fortress of crystal sealed off from the rest of the world. From the outside, it was still perfect. But after the night under the bridge, Julian saw it differently, like a piece of over-polished craftsmanship you just knew was rotting inside. He began watching not as a CEO, but as someone hunting for scratches. He quietly took notes, not about performance metrics, but about the data of the soul, details no KPI could measure. In the morning, he saw Samuel crouched beside a girl clutching a cello with a broken neck. Without asking questions, Samuel pulled a roll of black tape from his pocket, winding it carefully around the crack, his hands moving as if stitching a wound. The girl whispered a quick "thank you" before darting off, as though afraid of being caught. At lunch break, Samuel opened a track athlete's locker and slipped a protein bar inside. No name, no note, no trace. Julian knew the student, a runner whose performance had been slipping, with rumors of struggling with an eating disorder. These acts were small, but they carried weight. They didn't appear in reports, weren't branded as student wellness initiatives, and didn't need to be captured by camera. But Julian realized they were the real interventions keeping these kids from the edge. Then one afternoon, he witnessed hypocrisy at its peak. The Grand Hall of Ethelgard was draped with banners, a backdrop printed with the slogan, "Nurturing the Mind and Soul." Principal DeAngelis, in a sharply tailored Navy suit, stood at a row of microphones announcing a multi-million-dollar mental health initiative. "We are creating a safe environment where every student is heard and valued," she said, her voice warm as poured honey. Applause filled the room. Camera flashes lit up the air. Julian stood at the back of the hall, his hands clenched. He knew she was the one who had signed the expulsion order for Leo, simply because he painted disturbing images. With the same hands, she could preach about a safe space to the press and sign away a child's place for not fitting the mold. That evening, Julian went looking for Samuel. Not in the office, not in the cafeteria. He knew there was only one place Samuel could be without interruption: the boiler room. The metal door groaned as it opened. Inside, heat and the smell of old oil hung thick in the air, the yellowed light casting long shadows across pipes and gears. Samuel sat on a low wooden stool, sharpening a small saw blade. Julian stepped in, standing for a moment before asking, "Why you do this job, Samuel? You could be doing something else, something better than this." Samuel looked up. For the first time, his eyes lingered on Jay longer than a few seconds, as if trying to see through the shell of the maintenance trainee. He set the saw blade down. "I used to be a structural engineer," he began, his voice steady, as though telling a story he'd repeated many times. "I built bridges that connected shores miles apart. But I couldn't build a bridge to my own son." Julian stayed silent. "David," Samuel swallowed, as if the name had sharp edges. He was just like Leo, sensitive, artistic, unwilling to bend to the mold. They called him hard to teach. I was too busy, thinking he'd find his own way. I could calculate the tensile strength of steel, the load capacity of concrete, but I couldn't measure the weight on my boy's shoulders. He stared into the empty space ahead. David took his own life when he was 17. The heat in the boiler room grew stifling. Julian felt his throat dry. "Since then, I haven't wanted to build grand structures," Samuel said. "I just want to clean up the pieces left behind by people like me. I couldn't save David, but Leo, he's still here." A cold shiver ran down Julian's spine. He was a builder too, not of bridges, but of an educational empire. And he, too, had been obsessed with systems, results, and rankings. In Samuel's story, he saw a mirror, one that showed an ending he had never let himself imagine. He left the boiler room, walking through Ethelgard's long corridors. His footsteps echoed in the emptiness, like calls with no answer. For the first time, Julian felt afraid he was on the exact path to becoming Samuel, a father who learned the truth far too late. The Ethelgard Annual Gala was the pinnacle event of the year. The main hall had transformed into a crystal theater. Chandeliers dripped like waterfalls of light, and a red carpet stretched from the entrance to the stage. Donors in tuxedos and evening gowns held glasses of champagne, speaking in hushed tones while their eyes constantly assessed one another. At the back, near the service entrance, Julian stood in a faded gray maintenance uniform, hands in his pockets. He blended in with the kitchen and technical staff, invisible amid the splendor, exactly as he had planned from the beginning. On his phone screen, he watched the live feed from the control room. Principal DeAngelis, in a sleek navy suit, stood center stage, one hand resting lightly on the podium, bathed in the glow of a spotlight like a queen. Her voice rang across the hall, smooth and confident. Ethelgard is not just an academy. We are a family. We nurture the leaders of tomorrow with intellect, discipline, and compassion. Julian lifted his gaze, peering through the gap in the door. In the front row, donors nodded along as if listening to a soothing symphony. But to Julian, every word she spoke was a knife, slicing into the memory of the underpass, into the image of Samuel kneeling to light a candle for Leo. He looked down at his own hands. After 2 weeks of manual labor, calluses and small cuts had formed, nothing like the hands that once signed multi-million-dollar contracts. And tonight, those hands would work again, not to sign but to dismantle. When DeAngelis paused to receive applause, Julian stepped out of the shadows. His footsteps echoed on the varnished wood floor. A few people turned to frown. A voice from the middle rows muttered, "What's that janitor doing?" Security began to move. Julian didn't stop. He climbed the stage steps. "Stop!" His voice rang through the microphone the moment he reached the podium. "Let him be." The entire hall fell silent. Julian removed his cap, letting the lights hit his face. For a few seconds, only sharp intakes of breath could be heard. DeAngelis's face froze, her eyes widening as if she'd seen a ghost. Julian set his hand on the microphone. His voice didn't shout, but every word landed like a nail in the air. "I am Julian Croft. For the past 2 weeks, I have lived here as someone invisible." He let the sentence hang, giving the audience time to grasp its meaning. "And it is that invisibility that has shown me a truth no million-dollar report will ever show you." He didn't begin with accusations. He told the story of a man who spent his meager savings to buy a cake for a child the world had forgotten. A small candle lit in the rain, not to celebrate a birthday, but to mark the day that the child was abandoned. No names, no details, just images and emotion. But the weight of it filled the room. A few people lowered their eyes to avoid his. "We've built a palace of glass," Julian said, his voice tightening, "but forgot to put windows in for the soul. We teach our students how to succeed, but forget to teach them how to be human. And the greatest teacher in this school doesn't stand at a podium. He mops our floors." DeAngelis gripped the edge of the lectern, struggling to maintain composure. Julian turned fully toward her. "Our withdrawal program ends tonight, and you, DeAngelis, are officially relieved of your duties." A murmur swept through the hall like a sudden gust. DeAngelis started to protest, but Julian cut her off. "And the new position, Director of Student Care and Human Dignity, will go to Mr. Samuel Jones." A spotlight swung toward the doorway. Samuel stood there, still clutching his mop, his face stunned. People turned to look at him as if seeing him for the first time. Julian stepped aside, gesturing for Samuel to come forward. The old man remained frozen for a moment, as if afraid this was only a dream. Then slowly, he began walking up the aisle between the rows, the sound of his shoes like drum beats in a ritual. When Samuel reached the stage, Julian took his hand and raised it high. The hall was utterly still. And then, as if a dam had burst, applause roared. Not from everyone, but enough to drown out the silence. In that moment, Julian knew the storm had truly begun. Spring came late to New York, but when the first sunlight of the season poured through Ethelgard's glass walls, the campus felt reborn. Cherry blossoms along the walkways burst into soft pink clouds, petals drifting slowly, spinning before settling onto the warm brick paths. The air carried the scent of fresh grass, sap, and a faint trace of new paint, a sign of something rebuilt from old foundations. Julian walked slowly along the second-floor corridor, fingertips brushing the freshly polished oak railing. He had walked this hallway hundreds of times before, but it had always been different. Both walls lined with gold-framed portraits of donors, their faces stern and self-satisfied. Those eyes had once made the space feel as cold as a museum. Now the walls stood bare, leaving room for sunlight to spill freely through wide windows. That same light streamed down into the room below, a space transformed completely. Once the Hall of Honor, with brass plaques and framed photographs, it was now the David Jones Creative Studio, an open space alive with laughter, chatter, and color. The warm wooden floors were scattered with paint-stained rugs, bearing the marks of dozens of small hands. Long tables were covered in brushes, palettes, and jars of cloudy rinse water. The walls exploded with collages and legal graffiti created by the students themselves. Bold colors, daring strokes, sometimes chaotic, but always alive. In the center, Leo stood before a massive canvas propped on an easel. He wore a new moss-green hoodie, sleeves pushed up to reveal streaks of dried paint. His face no longer had the hollowed look from that rainy night under the bridge. His hair fell a little over one eye, but the gaze beneath it was bright and intent. With broad, decisive strokes, his brush laid a cityscape under rain, but each raindrop was a ribbon of vivid color. Red, yellow, purple, blue, like fireworks falling onto the streets. Each stroke seemed to place a fragment of hope into the gray storm. From the second floor, Julian leaned against the railing, watching not with the eyes of a CEO inspecting a project, but like a passerby stumbling upon a rare and precious moment. He didn't need to go down. He didn't want to break the rhythm flowing in that room. The glass door at the back opened, and Samuel stepped in. No longer in his faded janitor's uniform, he wore a light brown sweater and khaki trousers, moving slowly but steadily. In his hands were 2 cups of hot chocolate, steam curling into the crisp spring air. He set 1 cup beside Leo's easel. "For you," he said, his voice warm, like a promise without conditions. Leo glanced over and offered a faint smile, quick but enough to show trust. No thanks, no explanations. Samuel placed a hand on his shoulder, a brief, firm squeeze. It wasn't pity, it was recognition. You belong here. The sound of the brush swished steadily against the canvas. Leo bent forward, his strokes gaining confidence, as if some of Samuel's steadiness had passed into him. Around them, other students worked, one carefully layering colored paper, another laughing as they smeared paint with their hands. From above, Julian saw that the change wasn't only in Leo, but in this place itself. Once, the room existed only to display achievements, to flaunt donor generosity. Now, it was where children found their voices, in color, in lines, in the beautiful mess of freedom. Afternoon sunlight slanted through the tall windows, striking the wooden plaque on the wall. David Jones Creative Studio. The lettering was carved deep and left unpainted, with no spotlight, no gilding, yet it carried the weight of a true legacy. Julian turned slowly, walking down the corridor. Each step felt lighter. He remembered Samuel's voice in the boiler room. "I couldn't save David, but Leo's still here." Those words had now taken physical shape, alive before his eyes. When he opened the door to the outside, spring wind rushed in, carrying the scent of paint, laughter, and the faint rustle of cherry blossom petals skittering across the bricks. Julian paused, letting it all pass through him, then thought, "They say legacies are carved in stone. They're wrong. They're lit by a single candle in the dark." He stepped into the courtyard, petals spinning through the air before vanishing into the wide sky. And for the first time in years, Julian felt he was not just building an academy, but a true home for the soul. Sometimes one small candle in the rain is enough to light a lifetime. Julian Croft had found a crack in the perfect glass of his own life, and instead of sealing it, he chose to make it a doorway for the light to enter. Samuel Jones was no longer the invisible janitor, but the keeper of the flame for souls once on the verge of going out. And Leo, from a forgotten child under a bridge, now stood in the light, turning his rain into color. This story reminds us, success isn't measured only in numbers, but in the people we lift. So what about you? Who is this Samuel in your life? The one who placed a candle in your hand when the world turned away. Share your story in the comments because perhaps that light will reach someone who needs it most. And don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to Toch Story so you won't miss the next tale that touches the heart. Because sometimes one story is all it takes to change a life.